honorable guests, Dr. Gutierrez and Mr. Michael Lima, to share their presentation about the situation in Cuba and proposals for action that Canada can take. Thank you.
Thank you, MP Garnett Genuis, for your support of democracy around the world, and thank you, Orlando, for organizing this important event in democracy in Cuba. My name is Michael Lima. I'm the Director of Democratic Spaces, the Canadian NGO advocating for human rights and democracy in Cuba. Today, I speak to you as a Cuban-Canadian political refugee, human rights activist, and specialist in Cuban and Latin American history. I would like to emphasize the urgent need to review Canada's foreign policy towards Cuba in light of the escalating repression levels in the island following the pro-democracy protests of July 11, 2021. In an era of global confrontation between democracy and authoritarianism, it's crucial that Canada, in reformulating its policy, considers Cuba's active alignment with authoritarian regimes such as Russia and China. Cuba, with over 1,000 political prisoners, is the leading jailer of political prisoners in the Americas. Pro-democracy leaders like José Daniel Ferrer, Félix Navarro, Cicia Abascal, and countless brave Cubans arrested during the July 11, 2021 protests endure denial of medical care, prolonged isolation, and torture. Recently, as yesterday, we had the tragic news of a Cuban political prisoner, Luis Barrios, who died due to denial of medical attention with just 37 years of age. Meanwhile, Cuban civil society has faced unprecedented levels of surveillance and repression. Cuban dictatorship shamelessly aligns with Russia, actively participating in the asymmetric war against Ukraine by providing diplomatic, propagandistic, and military assistance to the Russian regime. In Cuba, the state-controlled media parrots the Kremlin propaganda, aiding the Cuban regime in covering up crimes against humanity perpetrated by the Russian regime in Ukraine. The disinformation reaches over 60 million people globally through Cuba-Visión Internacional signal via 5 satellites. But despite Canada's condemnation of disinformation in the war in Ukraine, the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission, the CRTC, still permits Cuba-Visión Internacional distribution in Canada. China's spy base in Cuba, confirmed by U.S. intelligence reports, is a security threat to the free world. Furthermore, an investigative report from the Insider magazine indicates that Russia, since 2014, has been reviving the Lourdes Radio Electronics Center in Cuba with a new state-of-the-art spy station using 21st century eavesdropping technology. A listening base of these characteristics not only represents a threat for the United States, for the national security of the United States, but also for Canada, as Russian specialists themselves have expressed that they have the technological potential to extend its frequency listening range to this country as well. Moreover, Cuba's support for authoritarian regimes from Venezuela to Nicaragua hinders the region's democratic advancement. However, despite the shameful repression in Cuba, Cuba generally faces limited international condemnation for its alliances with regimes like Russia and China. Until now, it has been the Cuban people who have made the regime pay the highest political cost when they took to the streets on July 11, 2021, and showed the world in 24 hours that the dictatorship did not have the support that it had shown in its propaganda for decades. Canada's foreign policy approach on Cuba appears inconsistent. While Canada enforces sanctions on designated individuals in regimes like Belarus for supporting Russia in the invasion of Ukraine, it refrains from implementing similar measures on key allies of Putin, such as the Cuban regime. Although Canada imposes targeted sanctions on officials from more than 20 dictatorships, Ottawa has yet to hold the Cuban high officials accountable for crimes committed during the July 11, 2021 repression. In response to formal requests from our organization, Democratic Spaces, and Cuba-Visión promoters, global affairs should be imposing effective sanctions on the most egregious human rights violators within Cuba's repressive apparatus. Instead, Ottawa's approach seems to prioritize trade over democracy and human rights. The Canadian government and private sector helped directly sustain the regime through tourism, channeling large revenues into GAESA, the Cuban military conglomerate that controls the tourist industry and other lucrative sectors of the Cuban economy. Ottawa could wield a more significant influence by openly addressing human rights violations instead of discussing them privately with regime officials. Alternatively, Canada could enhance its impact by opening his Havana embassy to provide support and access and communication with human rights activists and relatives of political prisoners in Cuba. There are precedents set for this in publicly defending human rights of the Cuban people during the government of Prime Minister Stephen Harper. As a notable example, on February 25, 2010, Lawrence Cannon, who was then the Minister of Foreign Affairs, offered condolences to the family of Orlando Zapata Tamayo, a Cuban prisoner of conscience and a human rights activist. Zapata Tamayo had tragically lost his life after an extended hunger strike, protesting the brutality within Cuba's prisons. In a public statement, Cannon called on the Cuban government to release political prisoners and uphold the rights and freedoms of the Cuban people. This time, Canada listened to the voices of the Cuban people. Cuba required more than just humanitarian aid in the form of medicine and food. The greatest humanitarian tragedy faced by Cubans is the unjust imprisonment of thousands for exercising their fundamental human rights. Canada should be leading international efforts to secure the immediate release of political prisoners, proclaiming its own moral grounds through motions in Parliament and resolutions in international bodies such as the United Nations Human Rights Council. It's neither morally nor strategically justified for the Canadian government to continue labeling the Cuban regime as an ally, promoting tourism and investment in an island governed by a regime that actively collaborates with Russia in the war against Ukraine. Canada is home to an extensive diaspora of 1.3 million Ukrainians, the world's second largest diaspora after Russia. Canada's key strategic objective to support Ukraine and sanction the Russian regime and its allies is global partnership, international, legal, and moral commitments to defend the human rights of this and many other communities, call for a response to a more broadly reformulation of Canadian foreign policy on Cuba. Standing in solidarity with the Cuban people in their quest for democracy aligns with Canada's best interests and democratic values. A free Cuba has the potential to enhance trade with Canada and serve as a pivotal step in liberating the island from the dictatorial regime that has historically leveraged Cuba's geographical proximity, just 90 miles from the Florida Keys, to assist authoritarian regimes like Russia, China, Iran, and others in their global dominance ambitions. A hemisphere free from the Cuban dictatorship would deter authoritarian expansion, achieving a triumph for democracy in Latin America. This would put a constraint on Russia and China's influence in the region, countering their plans to reshape the international order, thwarting their efforts against the United States, Canada, and the free world. Action is needed now. History shows that change doesn't happen without sustained pressure, and the success of any peaceful pro-democracy movement relies heavily on active international solidarity. The Cuban people's unwavering commitment to freedom and their sacrifices are undeniable. Holding the regime accountable through targeted sanctions, exerting pressure to release all political prisoners, and advocating for the rights of the Cuban people are of the utmost importance. It's time for Canada to rise up to the historic moment and support the Cuban people in their pursuit of freedom and democracy. We cannot allow silence and inaction to prevail. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll open it up for questions. Oh, okay. All right. Well, did you want to share your carrots, or should we go into sort of general discussion?
No, I'd like to share some thoughts.
Okay, go ahead, please. Yeah.
Stephanie, can speak?
Okay, sure. Okay, sí. Muchísimas gracias. Señora Bea me dije si puede decir algunas palabras en español para darle bienvenido y las gracias por estar con nosotros hoy. Primeramente quiero dar las gracias al señor Garnett Thank you very much, Garnett, for having us here today. Y también, señora, bienvenido a Ottawa. Sí, porque sé que fue muchos meses desde estar por aquí, entonces bienvenido otra vez. Y también Garnett reconoce mis colegios, señor Tony, señor Redecope, señor Arnold también, y finalmente señor Ana también. Sí, sé que Michael le dije que, pero como los conservadores tenemos una buena historia con el primer ministro Harper durante los años como 2006 hasta 2015 y también con los ancianos ministros como el señor ministro Jason Kenney y también ministro John Baird, porque tuvimos en este momento una estrategia de democracia y los derechos humanos, pero cuando tuve la oportunidad de trabajar con el ministro Peter Kent por el año 2009, tuvimos también la estrategia de las Américas. Y las estrategias de las Américas incluir la democracia, la prosperidad y también los derechos humanos. Y en este momento creo que tuvimos un estrategia específico, una estrategia sin como las oportunidades por las fotos como tenemos en este momento con el primer ministro señor Trudeau, por ejemplo. Para decir que nosotros, los conservadores, que tuvimos señor Judy Crow también, que tiene los amigos con nosotros aquí, los amigos que creen en la democracia, los derechos humanos, el buen futuro para Cuba. Y también, dado que tenemos ahora señor Pierre Poilievre como nuestro líder, con su esposo, Ana, sé que Ana es de Venezuela, sé que Venezuela no es Cuba, pero hay una historia similar entre los dos. Y mi punto es que con el gobierno del señor Harper, hubo un gobierno que estaba un amigo de Cuba, y creo que en el futuro con el señor Poilievre vamos a tener un amigo de Cuba también, con que podemos tomar los pedaños específicos por una buena futura y una buena relación que es real y una relación podemos encontrar una mejor futura por Cuba y por Canadá juntos. Entonces, muchísimas gracias por estar aquí. Sí. Gracias.
Well, first of all, I want to thank all of you for being here, especially Garnett Genuis and the MPs. I know how busy you are, so I want to go straight to the point of the message we'll bring today. And I think that Michael's presentation was excellent, very well prepared and very detailed. I simply want to cover 3 points in a very concise fashion, because I think these 3 points strike at the essence of what's going on in Cuba. And I want to begin, first of all, by telling you, I can tell Michael Lima has been very positively influenced by Canada, and he speaks slowly and pronounces everything. I'm very impressed. I'm very Cuban, so I normally speak fast, and when I'm passionate, I speak even faster. If you need to slow me down, tell me. There's no problem.
I think you translate it. You don't.
So, I want to begin by saying that yesterday, and I have to begin like this because I'm in the Parliament building, or one of the buildings of Parliament of a great democracy. Yesterday, a 37-year-old mechanic, Luis Barrios, whose only crime was to go out into the streets 2 years ago and peacefully protest for change in this country, was murdered by this regime. Not only did they deny him medical attention, him having serious respiratory problems, we also know that he was operated upon. The family doesn't know what the operation was about, and then he was found dead himself. That this kind of crime can still occur 90 miles away from the United States, in the Western Hemisphere, in the 21st century. and that this kind of crime can happen with impunity is a terrible thing, and it's a terrible commentary on what's happened with Cuba over these years. I know that too many political leaders will ignore this death. I ask you not to, because his life was worth something. His life was worth the integrity of it, and that he had the strength and the courage to one day leave his tools aside and go protest for the freedom of his people. So I'd like to begin thinking about him and what his life means. And the 3 points I want to discuss with you today, very briefly, are the following. Number 1, what is the nature of the regime? Number 2, why the regime hasn't fallen. Number 3, how it can change. Number 1, I want to emphasize here, because I have found this in the past speaking with Canadians and Europeans, the idea that the regime in Cuba is accidentally authoritarian. This is a myth. This is not grounded in historical reality. This is an intentionally totalitarian regime, and it was so even before it took power. And I've written a book, which I'm not here to promote, just giving you an example. In this book, Cuba, the Doctrine and the Lie, I traced the decisions taken by this regime from the very beginning, when they were still in the mountains, to how to create a totalitarian state in Cuba, which was something that could not be conceived in the 1950s. It was a prosperous country. It had institutions. Canadian institutions were very much present in Cuba. It had political issues, but they could be overcome through this democratic revolution that was being promised. The regime didn't do any of that. It purposefully built a totalitarian state. And this nature of the regime is important to understand why this regime has been consistent in how it behaves through the years. Never before in the history of Latin America had concentration camps been created for homosexuals. This regime did it. The greatest effort to de-Christianize and end a religion, the Christian religion, in any Latin American country took place under this regime. There are thousands of political prisoners and the thousands of people executed. And it's not from yesterday's news. They just killed another man, another Cuban citizen, for demanding freedom, for demanding that the same principles be respected for which that revolution was supposed to be fought. And it also shows you why this regime, which is in a terrible economic crisis, which they have created, because they wrecked the Cuban economy in order to control Cuba's large middle class and to control Cuban citizens, and now they can't turn back that wreckage. Until 1960, Cuba fed itself and exported food. Cuba today depends 100% on food imports from the U.S. and Canada. The U.S. embargo doesn't cover food, and we don't want it to cover food. We don't want our people to starve. But Cubans are starving from that regime. And the regulations in the totalitarian state it imposed on the countryside to this day. So this consistency in the regime explains why, now that they're desperate for funds and they're desperate for subsidies, even at a point like this, they still choose to send troops to Ukraine. Yes, they have sent troops to Ukraine. You don't send 3,000 men to fight in Ukraine under Russian orders without the regime being in agreement with it. This story, spewed by the regime that they're volunteers going to fight, and that's being accepted by so many, sadly enough, so many European politicians, is a lie. You don't get passports in Cuba unless the regime gives you the passport, especially if you're active military. And you don't get to go to Russia unless somebody sends you. And the evidence is clearly there about how many troops, where they are, and how they're joining this genocidal war against Ukraine. Just a few days ago, we saw Raul Castro's daughter call for the eradication of the state of Israel. Not standing up for Palestinian rights, not standing up for peace or a two-state solution. She clearly said, from the river to the sea, we have to eradicate Israel. In those words, more or less. And this nature of the regime, this vile nature, also shows the effect it has not only on the Cuban people, who are still subject to repression and oppression and discrimination consistently. It also explains the kind of role that regime plays in the region. Number one, the dictatorship in Nicaragua. The romantic Sandinistas that were touted as freedom fighters once again have imposed a draconian dictatorship on the Nicaraguan people. And they couldn't have put down the 2018 democratic uprising without the help of Cuban advisors and Russian advisors. And I can share a great deal of information on that, but all you need to do is speak with Nicaraguan political prisoners and ask them who the interrogators were. Cubans. Cubans and Nicaraguans speak very different Spanish, and it's very easy to identify. Even though they were hooded, they were leading their repression. What about Venezuela? that was at one point in time, Venezuela was the consolidated democracy of Latin America. What's it now? It's become a vassal state under the Havana regime. And again, find out who runs the dictatorship, who runs the repressive corps, who runs the customs and the airports. Cubans. Cubans sent by the regime to occupy Venezuela, which was a historic goal of Castro since he took power. What is the rule of this regime in Bolivia, where another dictatorship has been established? And this poses a great threat to the entire hemisphere. We should not diminish the role this regime plays in the democratic backsliding in Mexico, in Colombia, in Chile, what's going on in the region as a result of this regime. Ignore it. If we ignore it, we do it at our peril. 400,000 Cubans have left Cuba in the last 2 years. Through a illegal migratory bridge built by the regime in Cuba and the Sandinistas heading north towards Mexico. I can give you many statistics about the state Cuba is in because of this regime. Or total lack of food production. Cuba imports sugar. Cuba is a sugar importer. That's what the regime has done. Cuba imports rice. Cuba, that was the rice power of the hemisphere, imports rice. Cuba's cattle industry has disappeared. Cuba is the only Latin American country with a negative birth rate and the highest suicide rate in Latin America. I can cite so many more statistics, and it's due to this regime of what it does. And that's why men like Luis Barrios and women are suffering under this regime for fighting against it. 137 women are political prisoners in Cuba that we know of, for standing up for their communities, for fighting for a better future for their children. So the second point I want to address is, how does the regime survive? The regime survives fundamentally because of the impunity it's been granted by the democratic world. Today, the regime is no longer being financed by the Soviet Union. The Russians don't care to show that society as a model, like the Soviets did. Putin cares for that regime as a military and intelligence ally in the struggle against the free world and in the struggle against the United States. China is not investing in Cuba where it invested in other places. Again, it only cares for the regime in Cuba as a military and intelligence ally. And it alone, but strategically. Right now, Chinese banks have taken the communist regime in Cuba to court in London because of non-payment of debts. So why does the regime survive? Well, the Cuban people have repeatedly risen against the regime. In the last 2 years, the regime has mysteriously purged and killed 28 generals. The Cuban people, again, continue to rise over and over again against this regime. We've had protests as recently as last week. The regime has lost the street control it used to have because it no longer has money. It has neither ideology nor money for its informants. So how does it survive? It survives through the financing of the European Union. 27 democracies are keeping this regime going. In spite of the fact it insults and offends Europe by sending troops to Ukraine and many other dark deeds it carries out. This money is getting to Cuba through something called the Political Dialogue and Cooperation Agreement, right? The PDCA. There's no dialogue. Where's the dialogue on democracy in Cuba? It's been another ruse to fool the Europeans. And the other mechanism the regime has, which I think is very pertinent to Canada, is the Club of Paris. $3 billion have been lent to this regime over the past 3 years by the Club of Paris. And that money being lent, which the regime never pays back, and keeps on asking for a postponement of payments and new credit lines, includes a great deal of Canadian money. I have some very precise statistics I can give you. Why is the money of Canadian taxpayers going to fund this regime? It makes no sense to the national interest of Canada, nor for the human rights situation. Change can happen in Cuba. The Cuban people have demonstrated their will to freedom over and over again. The regime has serious internal issues and problems which are becoming ever more evident. It is facing grave economic pressure right now. But sadly enough, that grave economic pressure is not being accompanied by the political pressure other dictatorships in the region received in order to open the way to democracy. Compare the pressure that the Pinochet dictatorship or the Somoza dictatorship received in Nicaragua and Chile to what is the kind of pressure placed on this regime. So it has to be a combination of real economic sanctions, such as looking again at the Club of Paris and what Michael recommended, and the international demand for free elections in Cuba, for release of political prisoners, for the cessation of repression against civil society. It's been 64 years of war by that regime against the Cuban people. It's time for it to halt. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for two